So the ANC has withdrawn its Electoral Court challenge to compel the IEC to extend its timetable to allow for submissions of outstanding candidates. It's still unclear whether the party has in fact decided to pin its hopes on a constitutional court ruling on the postponement of the local government elections. For a sense of what to make of these developments, let's bring in legal analyst, Advocate Modidima Manyya, who joins us now via our video link, also to explore some legal options available for the governing party, if you like. Advocate Manyya, it's great to see you. Thanks very much indeed for making time for us here on the AM Report. Let me just begin by gauging what you make of this about turn. I mean, the ANC essentially pulling back 24 hours or less than 24 hours after initially submitting those papers.
Yes, good morning and good morning to your viewers. You know, with the bit that I've read about the application, I don't even think it stood any chance whatsoever. I mean, based on the affidavit of the Deputy Secretary General, it is clear that whilst the system may have presented some challenges, but the real issue was within the ANC. And I mean, she highlights the implications of the non-payment of salaries and the impact thereof on the staff. But I must indicate that we are 17 months into COVID now. The government, which is basically led by the ANC, has been agitating and encouraging us and directing us to behave in a particular way and do things in a particular way. So I do not understand why we can use COVID as an excuse for having not done things on time.
Absolutely. Interesting, though, to still try and, decode what can still happen from this point onwards. I mean, from where I'm sitting, there's still no much clarity, I beg your pardon, around whether or not the Constitutional Court can even postpone the elections to begin with. In a context where that seems like the only solution for the ANC, how do you envision that panning out?
Well, let's separate two issues. I would be extremely concerned if the Constitutional Court were to postpone the election. I don't think it's their call. I don't think it's their jurisdiction and responsibility.
Right.
Regardless of the fact that we may in fact be facing real problems of whether we'll have a proper election. But I think for the Constitutional Court to enter that fray will simply justify what we have been hearing, that it is overreaching and encroaching into the separation of powers. Separately, the issue of the ANC, and not only the ANC, because I know that the UDM had raised concerns about its inability to register candidates. But I think the question really is whether anybody is deprived of their right to vote, and I don't think so. Everybody still has the right to vote for a party of their choice, but the party of choice must comply with the electoral laws of the Republic of South Africa. Now, whether the ANC has got choices, I doubt, because the choice that was there is where Parliament is in Cape Town, which could have reviewed the situation, reviewed the electoral laws, and responded in terms of what they think are the challenges facing the country at the moment. Obviously, the Constitutional Court not making a ruling that has the effect of postponing the election must go ahead.
Even if the Constitutional Court did postpone the upcoming government elections, that doesn't necessarily mean that the process to submit candidate lists would also be reopened. In other words, no matter how this goes, the ANC could still find itself in big trouble.
Well, not necessarily, because remember, the deadline for the registration is attached to the deadline for the voting or the date of the voting. So it might as well that the process has to be reworked and the timetable revised. One of the concerns I think the IEC has raised was that it will not have a registration weekend, to improve on the voters' roll. So that the implication of an order that postpones the election may be that the timetable must be revised and therefore they will still have an opportunity to register.
Is that a far-gone conclusion, though? Because the concerns around COVID-19 was the ability for electioneering to happen and for people to vote safely. There weren't actually concerns raised around the system and the process in the lead-up to putting together an election, which is, I think, where the issue is for the ANC specifically.
Well, if the government put regulations in place to restrict our movement because of a national health emergency, but allowed us to go and shop, allowed children to go to school, allowed categories of workers to go to work, allowed people to go shopping and get vaccinated, it means that is our new normal. And we could have used the same approach in terms of campaigning. I think the issue of campaigning, it seems to be based on the fact that we must have big rallies. And I don't necessarily think that all political parties benefit from having big rallies. I think that there are a number of opportunities that political parties could have used to campaign. One of the real issues, and I think this is the unfortunate situation in which the ANC finds itself, is that the internal conflicts have escalated to an extent that it is even not possible, even if it was not for COVID, to have some of these things. I mean, you can see that the senior leaders of the ANC are at each other's throats. The ground is on each other's throats. So I don't necessarily think that COVID is the issue here. I think the ANC is facing an unfortunate situation of unprecedented internal strife, which is having a major impact. I mean, for instance, without COVID, do you think that if the employees of the ANC were not paid, do you think their morale would be high enough to do their work diligently? The answer is a no.
Yeah, absolutely. You certainly do get the sense that, the IEC's processes are being used ostensibly as the reason for why the ANC is quite frankly unprepared, when we know that there are bigger crises taking place behind the scenes. That said, though, with everything considered, if the elections, for instance, do go ahead, how worried are you that the IEC is essentially poised to declare them not necessarily free and fair, considering the fact that the IEC have accepted the recommendations from the Moseneke inquiry?
Well, look, firstly, I think we must be very concerned that the IEC, as one of the institutions supporting constitutional democracy, must not be discredited. I think we have seen a vicious campaign to discredit the judiciary. If the IEC plays in the hands of those who want to discredit our constitutional democracy, we are going to pay a price. The IEC has said it is ready to conduct an election. The Moseneke process is really an unfortunate process because it comes when the IEC itself has said it has satisfied itself that it can conduct an election. Now, if it comes out and says the election was not free and fair, the first question would be, why did you even tell South Africans that you are ready to conduct an election? But having said that, the process of determining the fairness and otherwise of an election is dependent on what happens during the election itself. For instance, if there's unprecedented violence and people are prevented from voting, that would render the election not free and fair. But the fact that a political party was unable to register, and therefore those who would have voted for that party decide not to vote, cannot render an election not free and fair. I mean, that would be a red herring.
Absolutely. A last quick one, Advocate Manyya. The IEC, I think, if my memory serves me well, said it needed to know by the 30th of last month already whether or not we're going to go ahead with these elections this year. That obviously hasn't happened. Keeping in mind the dangers of pressurizing the Constitutional Court to give out its ruling, how much time do you reckon the Constitutional Court still has before it simply has to say something?
Well, firstly, let me say that nobody can ever put pressure on a court. Courts don't operate on that basis. If a matter is brought on an urgent basis, the court deals with it on an urgent basis. So there's no question of the Constitutional Court being put under pressure. But secondly, as matter stands, the date of the election has been proclaimed, and I assume that the IEC is working on the basis that there is going to be an election in October. Remember, the situation can only change if there's a court order that alters the position which is currently there. So one expects that the IEC, and I think this is why when the story of the registration of candidates came in, and the IEC put its foot down, which is commendable. So I assume that they are working on the basis that they are proceeding with the election in October, unless and until the court makes a ruling.
Advocate Modidima Manyya, thanks very much indeed for your time. Really do appreciate it. Advocate Manyya is a legal analyst.